Ever wonder what it really takes to make zero trust work in practice? Welcome to Zero Trust Journey, the podcast that cuts through the noise and dives into real stories and strategies to bring zero trust to life. The cybersecurity world is flooded with buzzwords and vendor hype, but here we focus on what truly matters, practical insights and lessons from those who've walked the path. Each episode is inspired by real experiences, grounded in our research, and enriched by the challenges and triumphs of our guests. If you're ready to grow your skills, deepen your insights, and take actionable steps toward a stronger zero trust strategy, you've come to the right place. Let's get started. The views and opinions expressed on the Zero Trust Journey podcast, webcast are solely those of the participants and do not represent the views of their employers or affiliated organizations. This content is provided for educational and informational purposes only. Neither the employers nor any sponsors are liable for actions taken based on the content discussed.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Zero Trust Journey. Today we have an exciting guest, Allie. Allie, thanks for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here. Steve, I know you have a relationship with Allie. Do you want to go ahead and introduce her to our audience?
Oh, absolutely. And I do not think I can do justice by our amazing guest today. I've had the fortunate experience of working with Allie previously at Forrester, but Allie, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our viewers? Tell them a little bit about yourself, kind of what you're doing, where your passions lie. We're very excited to have you on the show today.
Absolutely. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. It's always fun to see you again, Steve, and to hang out with y'all. Love the podcast. So I'm Allie Mellen. I'm a principal analyst on the security and risk team at Forrester, and I cover security operations. So all things people, process, and technology in the SOC. Detection engineering is a big part of that. XDR is a big part of that. The SIM market, big part of that. I also cover nation state threats and AI and its use in security tools. So as you can tell, nothing very exciting, not an area where a lot of things are happening. But my background is in computer engineering. I was a computer engineer before becoming a hacker and then becoming a security practitioner and then ending up at Forrester. So I've seen this from a lot of different angles and am very, very happy to be here and have this conversation with y'all.
I think one thing that you're probably underselling that a lot of people I haven't seen is kind of happened in reverse for you is you presented at Black Hat before kind of like the big hits of your career.
Yeah.
So can you talk about that real quick? Because I just always thought that was such an interesting part of your career story and kind of how you've gotten involved in things.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely can. So I was in college getting my degree in computer engineering, and we had one cybersecurity class at BU at the time, and I took it. And it was with an amazing professor. His name is Ari Trachtenberg. I believe he's still at BU, still teaching this class. And the reason that it was so amazing is because it was incredibly hands-on. This was not a class where you were sitting and learning theoreticals. This was, you're hacking a server for your midterm. You're hacking and defending a server for your final. You are in it. And so we also had a midterm project, and that midterm project was to either come up with some novel research, novel security research, or to duplicate someone else's. And so me and a couple of my classmates at the time were like, let's do something different. And we ended up turning the Square reader, the little chip reader that a lot of merchants use, into a credit card scammer. And it was really fun. It was via a hardware encryption bypass, which was kind of a cool way of doing it too, kind of a nice way of combining the software and the hardware components. We had a few other things that we did as part of that as well on the software side, but that was the meat of it. And we presented it to him, and he was like, this is very cool. Have you considered submitting it to Black Hat? And I was like, what's Black Hat? And so we did end up submitting it, and it got accepted. And so my first real experience with the security community was actually flying out to Vegas, speaking on this, getting on CNN and CNBC for the work, and just getting to know a really cool community that I immediately really enjoyed and found a lot of joy in. So I'm very, very grateful and very lucky that I got to be introduced to it that way. And it's been really great ever since.
Nice. Ali, I share the little bit of same background. I was an ethical hacker, turned into a blue teamer. And one question I get asked a lot, and I'll ask you, what made you switch the hacking or quote unquote cool stuff to being a SOC analyst, or actually just looking at the blue teamer side as well?
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually, and I'm very curious your answer too. For me, I think that there reaches a point where the cool stuff isn't enough anymore, and I kind of reached that point. Like, absolutely, it is so fun to do things like ethical hacking, but at the end of the day, there's something much more meaningful in it for me to be on the defender side and to be focused in on that and to be making sure that that's my contribution to the space. Of course, ethical hackers have a huge contribution to the defensive side as well, but I thought that I had something to say that was unique on the defensive side, looking at it from like that enterprise and that government perspective. And I wanted to embrace that a little bit more. But how about you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I always said it that for me, I was getting sick and tired of generating the same problems for the teams every
So
year.
true.
I wanted to be the part of the solution now. So I brought my ethical hacking mindset into the defender side and help them actually see things a little bit differently and be part of the solution as well, fix things for them as well, with them as well.
It's so funny that you say that because it's so true. I think that people, especially outside of the industry, don't always realize that being an ethical hacker is not like sitting at your desk all day finding 0 days. It's very much so just like repeated attempts at the same type of things in different places and seeing if it works. And so it is nice kind of having a little variety on the
Exactly.
defense side.
And once a hacker, always a hacker. So you keep that mindset always, even if you're working for the blue team, or you always find ways how it can be penetrated or exploited. And so you bring that mindset at the table of blue teamer, and then having that someone on the table helps them see it differently as well. So it's not how this knob actually helps me detect or prevent or protect, but how are the other ways that it can be exploited. So that's the mindset bring on the table that helps for the blue teamer.
For sure. I think that that is so true. And it is so funny because it informs everything that I do, having both of those perspectives, and especially like the computer engineering in the background. It just all comes together to kind of fit in these weird places. Like even my perspective on AI is so colored by having both of those experiences and being able to kind of think about it from both sides. So could not agree more.
Can you tell us a little bit about your introduction to Zero Trust? What did you think when you first heard of it? And how has your background shaped your perspective on it?
I'm so glad you brought it up because I think that we are legally required to as Forrester analysts, as Steve knows. We have to bring it up at least once every time we talk. My introduction to Zero Trust, it happened before Forrester, of course, because it's always a topic of conversation in the defensive community. But I think that where I really started to understand it in a very different way was at Forrester, and actually through working with Steve quite a bit, because I have always been a bit skeptical of Zero Trust, to be honest. I've been very skeptical of honestly, like all of us, all of the buzzwords that come out of these things. But I think that the thing that I've really learned about Zero Trust that has made it something, and especially in my time at Forrester, has made it something really valuable, is that it is a timeless framework for how you approach security. And that is really, really important. And I think like when you dig into the specifics of Zero Trust and how people are actually doing it, you come up with some pretty cool things. We all spend a lot of time focused on, how do you get buy-in? Once you get past that, that's where you get to some really cool, like this is an implementation, and it's an implementation that when done well, actually really enables the rest of the business in a way that you want them to be enabled. Like we see a lot of teams that start with identity and with the users and with the workforce with Zero Trust, and they find so much value in that because they're actually able to show the benefit of taking that approach to the workforce instead of it just being this behind the scenes thing. I mean, similarly, I think it's such a connector for much of the organization beyond what we are in security. I did a case study a couple of years ago with Sask Power where I actually interviewed the enterprise architect there because he was a former security practitioner turned enterprise architect who believes in Zero Trust and wanted to implement those principles across Sask Power. And so we talked about the buy-in side, but we also talked about how he, as the enterprise architect, has so much power to make sure that Zero Trust actually gets implemented. And so I think that there's an element of this where we need advocates across the organization, and it can be really something to help the security organization get out of just being in the security organization, if that makes sense.
So I love the call out around implementation, right? So that's the whole reason that we're all kind of here, is to talk both strategic and from the implementation side. So with your kind of unique background around other areas, and as part of my bingo board, as you kind of hit off on all the buzzwords in describing what you covered. How has zero trust and kind of the security operations lens, how have those things lent themselves to each other, especially from that implementation perspective? Because I can imagine that from some of the previous research that you've done around XDR, for example, kind of unifying all of these different areas within an organization, zero trust kind of being that one lens higher, I'd love to hear, if you have anything to share around things from an implementation perspective.
Totally. It's such an interesting question because a lot of times I'll talk about my coverage and I'm like, I do all the cool stuff. Detection and response is the cool stuff. And people are like, no, what about prevention? And I think from the one angle, zero trust is incredibly beneficial because it is what enables security operations to have to do less work or at least more important work. Obviously, you can bring down the alert volumes if you're preventing things instead of having to detect everything. So that's the first thing is I do think that it improves analyst experience in the SOC because it reduces the number of alerts that they have to address. And it also gives you a framework for when you're going through your response recommendations and your remediation recommendations, what should be done first and why. And so I think that that connection back between prevention and detection and response is really important with zero trust. But I also think that when we look at like that example that I used before of starting with identities, what is one of the most attacked things that security operations sees right now? It's identities in the cloud. And so the more that we are able to standardize with zero trust, the way that we approach identities and the cloud, that makes it easier for security operations to get the data that they need to fire the alerts that they need to do the response actions that they need. And so it helps in a lot of ways to just simplify for security operations what they need to focus on and the data that they need coming in to make those determinations. That's really important. And then the other way is kind of I'm trying to decide if it's helpful or not. It's helpful in some ways, but we see a lot with the SIM around bringing in alerting around like process changes or configuration management changes into the SIM, which can be helpful because it's more context for the security operations team. It also costs more. So it's kind of a balance there, but it unifies things even more. And there is value in that for sure.
So one kind of like thread to pull on all of that is in talking to a lot of folks as they've gone and implemented a variety of different solutions. I'm probably going to bring up like some hot debate here in a second, but like platform versus best in breed. That's, I think, when I look at the whole kind of sphere of different vendors out there, I remember back in the day that, for example, CrowdStrike was like, no, best in breed, like we're partnering with these alliances and everything. And now you go and read all of their marketing material and it's like, platform is best, buy into our platform. It's like I get that things evolve, but marketers going to market and all of those things. But I would love to hear kind of your insights on that front because it's been such a hotly debated topic, I think, in practitioner circles. I still work with a lot of customers who swear by best in breed, but every other day is a fire drill for them, troubleshooting things from a user experience perspective, which I think gets left out of the equation a lot of times. So would love your perspective on that.
Yeah, the user experience piece is such an important part of this that people miss too. I completely agree with that. So there's a couple of angles to this. We have data. We track every year thousands of security decision makers, their responses to a variety of questions, right? Things like, what are your biggest challenges? What are your top priorities? How many breaches were you affected by last year? What were the cost of those breaches? Things like that can give us some really interesting data. One of the questions that we ask is, do you prefer best of breed or platform as your approach? And the answers to that are like a sine wave. They go up and they go down. One year it's platform, the other year it's best of breed, one year it's best of breed, the other year it's platform. So it's constantly going back and forth, which is, I find interesting because it's basically like the practitioners are having the same debate that the vendors are in many ways about this. I think it depends heavily on the use case. Ideally, having tools that work together effectively, like we see that as a huge driver for a lot of the consolidation in the market. But that relies on the fact that the tools are going to work together well. And even tools from one vendor do not work together well in most cases, right? We see a lot of acquisitions that happen, and it means that when you're trying to use a bunch of different tools from one vendor, they may have an overlaying skin that's all one thing, but that does not mean that they work outside of the demo together.
But they acquired it. I don't know what you're talking about. It's part of the portfolio. They renamed it.
So I do think it's interesting because depending on the area that we're talking about, there are very different answers. Take SOAR as an example, right? That's one of the things that I cover in the context of SIM. And we see a lot of SIM vendors that have acquired SOAR providers. They've either integrated them fully or created some level of integration. It can be really useful to use that from one provider. But for some practitioners who are a little bit more risk averse, they're like, no, I need a separate SOAR because I do not want this affiliated with any other vendor. I want them to be completely agnostically making the integrations that they're making between these tools. So they're not going to push me one way or another. And so that's one example where I think there are arguments for both sides of that conversation. And to be honest, it seems like some of the best SOAR capabilities we have are still to some extent separate from the SIM capabilities. Depends on the vendor, but if you look at the top vendors in the space around SOAR, you start to see a pattern. Now, this is quite different if you look at XDR as an example, because the only way to get better outcomes with XDR is if you extend beyond the endpoint and bring in telemetry from additional sources. And you can get some really high quality detections that way. But the vendor has to have a very intentional strategy about what they're implementing and bringing in from their own portfolio. And my concern is, how do we balance the fact that vendors want a vendor and sell as much as they can of their products, but that may not achieve better outcomes for the customer. And that's a trade-off that they have to constantly be facing. And I think it helps the conversation when we come in and say, okay, what's the value add here? We need to actually see a real value add, because I don't always see that. It's much more for the business reasons than it is for bettering the users' lives.
One thing I was going to add here, Allie, we talk a lot about it on this show where a lot of times vendors dictate customer requirements. When it comes to zero trust as well, a lot of time vendors saying, oh, in order to achieve zero trust, you need these three things, or here's what my solution, or my product is zero trust certified. Having zero trust principles, and we had Chase on this show as well, he said, I don't care what you want to call it. Call it hokey pokey, call it whatever you want. And as long as you meet the principles of zero trust, that's what really dictates it. So I'm interested in your opinion on this one as well. When you talk to the SOC analysts or when you talk to the strategists who are actually creating the SOCs, does zero trust come in as a requirement? Do they say that based on the zero trust principles, this is what I want to have my solutions, my platforms, or best in breed to dictate the requirements? Or is it still the other way around where the traditional way of SOC, I just want to have alerts, incidents, and I want to close them faster? Or do they actually look at from the zero trust principle aspect as well?
Okay, so interesting, because I think one of the most underrated and misunderstood parts of this zero trust conversation is what the aspect that we call security analytics and monitoring is, because we don't talk about that enough. In fact, I think that in the SOC or with the administrator of the SIM, even when they're bringing in alerts around configuration changes and things that are not related to an attack, they are not thinking of it in the context of zero trust. They're just thinking of it in the context of something's wrong, we need to fix it. But it should be thought of in that broader context of zero trust, because it is a core part of that conversation and of what needs to be done. Now, I very strongly, and Steve knows this and Steve agrees, we've had many conversations about this, I do not like the idea of zero trust being a product conversation or vendors saying you need this product to do zero trust. There's a lot that leads to that. I think, unfortunately, in our analyst experience research, which is about SOC analyst experience, not me analyst, we talk a lot about how all of these tools have been created for the economic buyer, not the user, and how the training around them can run the gamut, right? You have some tools with extremely good training. You have some tools with not so great training. The one thing that you don't have is, besides a couple of select and very expensive organizations, is training for what it means to be a security practitioner. And this causes a huge gap in the market that vendors fill with zero trust means buy our tool or buy our set of tools instead of the principles of zero trust and what that means. Now, we see some of that gap trying to be filled in academia. I've worked with and served as a subject matter expert for some of these groups in these conversations about like, okay, you want to get a master's in cybersecurity, let's go through that process, or bachelor's or what have you. But the problem is that it's so theoretical. And I think that there's a lot of value in academia, but security is a really hard one to do well in academia. Like at the end of the day, everything is so many different trade-offs. And unfortunately, in many of the conversations that I see happening in those circles, it's that company got breached. Why didn't they just do zero trust? And it's like, well, you have to take into account that they have a business they have to run, and they have resource constraints, and they have people constraints, and there's a lot of things that happen all at once. And they have all these vendors telling them how to do zero trust and that it's a specific way of doing it. And even when they implement it, they're not actually getting it done. And so I think that there's a big gap in the market right now just for understanding and training around what a security practitioner is and what the specialization of being a security practitioner should look like. And it's one of the things that we definitely try to address in some of our research, but it's not the same thing as actually having like standards and training around what that means. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah, I think just to pull on that thread, and then I want to hand it over to Zach. I think I've spoken to you at length, Allie, of like not having a formal education and just trying to find my way like in the industry without a degree and kind of all of that type of stuff. I know that I've seen, to your point, the very large, maybe say all the big cloud providers who are the ones that are kind of driving that non-traditional education around what it means to be a security practitioner and giving free classes and all of that stuff. But of course, it's colored in a way that it's like you used Chronicle to investigate an incident, or you're utilizing Sentinel to dive into these particular alerts. Do you have any recommendations for our audience on places that they can get some of that research? Maybe they're just starting out in the industry. Maybe they've been in the industry in a while and vendors have polluted, what it means for a lot of different things for them, especially, your call out around, the conversations we've had about zero trust products. Labeling all these features as zero trust, I think has confused many people and, made them believe something is when it actually isn't. And so I don't know if you had any recommendations or anything that you've come across that our audience could dial into to kind of level up their knowledge around that.
Yeah, it is a very hard question. I mean, there are not a lot of things that are achievable for most people, right? I mean, ideally, we could all pay for SANS training and be expert red teamers, right? But
yeah,
that's not how it works. The people
second mortgage to go get that kind of training.
The people that are using those programs are working at companies that are sponsoring them to be there, which is great, and they should be, but it still leaves a gap for others. I do think that for those who are coming in from non-traditional backgrounds, it has to be hands-on. It has to be like, yeah, you're doing an IT admin job for a couple of years to better understand what an enterprise network looks like, what enterprise infrastructure looks like. It has to be like one of the things that I think is a benefit, if there could be one coming out of the pandemic, is a lot of the conferences that were previously only in person are now also online. And typically the online version is free. And so attending a couple of B-sides remotely or attending some of the other conferences remotely, like Cyber WarCon, you can get some really cool information and really cool research that you otherwise wouldn't have access to, and that is typically very much so focused on the actual skills of being a security practitioner as opposed to like, oh, it's another vendor webinar or what have you. And so those tend to be the places where I go if I'm like, okay, what's changing? Like I want to sit in on a panel on detection engineering and see what people are talking about there and really get to the root of it. And then I think the only other thing is to find groups within the security community that you can relate to. Like for me, it was always like Women in Security and Privacy and some of the women's groups that are in the cybersecurity space, having those connections and those people that are willing to help you and also that you're willing to help in the space is so important, because cybersecurity is a community and everything happens within the community. It's very small while also being pretty big. And so the more that you integrate into the community, the easier it is to start actually getting a job in it and being part of it.
No, I love that. Passing over to you, Zach.
Thanks, Steve. I did not want to interrupt that because Steve pulled on a great thread. But there's one thing that you mentioned earlier in the conversation that I wanted to probe a bit more on, which was identity. And you started talking about how you've been talking to people who have been starting with identity. But one of the things we've heard in previous episodes of this podcast and talking with other practitioners is some level of disagreement on the phrase identity is the new perimeter. So
Gosh.
I wanted to get your thoughts on what you think about that and what you see as a reality.
No pressure, Ali.
No pressure. Yeah.
Steve knows very well that I'm not a huge fan of network security or anything having to do with network security, I'll be honest. And so I often associate it with perimeter security and kind of that type of approach, whether it's fair or not. I think Steve is one of the people who has changed my mind, or at least given me a much better perspective about the network security side of things than I had before. So long story short, I don't really like anything that talks about perimeter.
No.
Like, what does it matter? Like, we don't have a perimeter. It doesn't make any sense to talk about this as if we have a perimeter that we could control or like set up little men on with their spears to prevent any attacks, like we just don't, we don't have that anymore if we ever really did. And so I think about identity and cloud as kind of the next very fundamental and critical frontier for detection and response. That's much more how I like to approach it, because I think that the efficacy that you can get from identity and from the cloud is really powerful. We see a lot of very high profile attacks that have been caught because of MFA. So prioritizing those is not only something that we believe in at Forrester, especially for security operations, but it's also something that we see regularly in practice. If you look at some of the XDR vendors as an example, the aspects that they're most likely to integrate are email security, identity, and cloud into their EDR or existing EDR/XDR products. And that's because you can get a lot of really valuable signal there. Now, I think cloud is a bit of a different ballgame. It's very difficult. The reason that most XDR vendors are integrating that in is because they have a pretty natural cloud workload security tool. But once you get into more of the aspects of what cloud looks like in totality, from like the SaaS applications to a lot of the core infrastructure and of course to cloud workloads, then you start getting a more complete picture of where your data is and the ways that attackers may be trying to target it. That's much more compelling. So TLDR, I don't love any term related to perimeter, but I do think that identity is incredibly important. And it's been really fascinating to see how that maps back into zero trust.
Love that. Yeah, we take the same stance on this podcast when we talked about this a number of times, in that, when we talk about zero trust, we think of it as a philosophical shift as well as a technological shift. And when we, approach things like saying identity is the new perimeter, we're still referencing an old mindset that we're trying to break away from. And so it doesn't resonate with us either. So thank you there. Victor, pass it to you.
Yeah, everything what we're talking about, very insightful. One question I have, Riley, is when you're talking to the strategic leaders of the SOC or even in cybersecurity in general, are there still people who are thinking that zero trust is not something that they want to incorporate? And again, they might use different terms like least privilege or defense in depth. But are there people who are still thinking that zero trust is still a buzzword and this is not something that I need to consider in my company or in my organization?
So everyone that I talk to that's a practitioner thinks zero trust is a buzzword.
Okay.
If I'm being totally honest.
Yeah.
But that said, they're all implementing it. They're just, to your point, calling it different things.
Funny how that works, right?
Yeah.
So I do think that there's a level here of just like the name can bug people because it's overused. But that doesn't change its importance. The Other piece of that too is that I do think that we notice quite a bit using the term zero trust outside of the security organization is not helpful. If you tell your CEO or your head of HR that you're going to be taking a zero trust approach to security, they're like, that sounds scary. What does that mean? And so it becomes very important to context switch into a language that they'll understand better. And oftentimes that's not going to be through the phrase zero trust. It can even have different connotations for different cultures. And so it's very important to think about how to position that well, which is one of the reasons why we come back to identity and protecting the workforce. Because to this conversation about like identity as the new perimeter, what we're ultimately trying to do with zero trust is to make it so that the employees can do the work that they need to do effectively in any way that they need to do it that is within the bounds of least privilege. And I often think that that should be enabling a little bit more freedom as the kind of like the way that we position it than trying to like not trust anyone, you know, because that's ultimately what we're doing. If we install a perimeter and that's the only thing that you can be a part of and be in, then that's basically saying you're stuck. You are not free to move freely. You're stuck within the confines that we have created versus what we're actually doing with zero trust is saying, we're going to make it so that you can operate in the confines that you prefer, but make that as secure as we possibly can.
No, 100%. And we totally encourage every listener out there that come up with a better term if you can for us so that we can help.
Okay, I will say.
All right, go, Allie.
I don't love to give Kindervog credit, but I think the term zero trust is pretty good.
Yeah.
It's a pretty cool term for it all.
It is. It's badass.
Yeah, 100%. I think we all agree to the term, but when you actually, to your point and example, when you start talking to your business leaders and the HR that, hey, we're trying to implement zero trust, they're like, what's wrong with our people? Why don't we trust them? We vet them. We did the background check already. We trust them, hence they're here. So it's just coming up with something, and again, taking Chase's example, call it hokey pokey or whatever you want to call it within your organization. Whatever works for you, as long as you enforce the principles of zero trust, and at the end of the day, enable and accelerate the employee effectiveness of how they actually use the system and do their day job, and that's what it is at the end of the day. So that you bring that transparent security instead of that the perimeter with the guns and the tanks at the perimeter. We don't have that.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's all compromised. And that's like one of the things that the enterprise architect I was talking about earlier was so adamant about is he was like, yeah, I know that the security people are going to want to make it so that you have to like authenticate every single time.
Oh, God.
Yeah, this is an example that really upsets everyone. But he was like, that's just not going to be productive for the workforce. So we're going to find a balance where you're going to have to authenticate during certain circumstances, but it's not going to be as excessive as security might like it to be. And so it's about compromise. And I think that that's like one of the cool things that I see is I meet a lot of CISOs that when I talk to not their teams, but other teams in their companies, they're like, it's just a cool person. Like they're always very chill. They're always someone that I can come and talk to, and they're always someone that's looking for ways to compromise with me and to make it so that we can accomplish everything that we want. That's what we need from security professionals. We need that kind of mindset. Every time I hear about a CISO like that, I'm like, that's cool. That's someone who gets it and gets the job.
We'll say a prayer for you, Victor. This has been awesome, Allie. We do have to wrap it up, but I'm sure we could continue talking for hours. So we want to really thank you for joining us on the show, sharing your insights. Where is the best way for our audience to connect with you?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was a ton of fun. The best way to connect with me is on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn and also on Substack. So you can find me at either of those places, and I post very regularly to both.
Great. Audience, do go check her out. She posts some great stuff there. And thank you again to our audience for tuning in for another episode of Zero Trust Journey. And we will see you next time.
Thank you, Allie.
Thank you, Allie.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for joining us on Zero Trust Journey. If this episode sparked new ideas or gave you practical insights, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with your network. Your support helps us continue bringing you valuable conversations and real-world stories. We'd love to hear from you. Share your feedback or even your own Zero Trust journey by reaching out to us. Your story could inspire others in the community. Stay tuned for more expert insights, compelling stories, and actionable advice to help you advance your zero trust strategy. Until next time, stay curious and keep making progress on your zero trust journey. See you in the next episode.